My name is Ben Orozco. I am a multimedia artist and designer, and this is The Layered Onion. Yeah, it's a very complex process that hasn't changed for more than 100 years, I would say. So you start with a glass tube that might have a coating inside of it, like phosphor. You take that glass tube and you start to create bends over a torch. And we do that in a sequence to create a shape over a table. And then once you have that shape, you will attach something called an electrode to it, which are these little pieces of metal. You attach that to a system called a manifold, which will empty out the atmosphere that is around us and put a noble gas like neon or argon in it. And then from there, you can seal that piece and electrify it. It was definitely a it was definitely a journey. So I To preface everything, or just to add a lot of context, working in glass and neon is just it's a very challenging discipline to be a part of because of how resource intensive it is in terms of facilities and financial support, and a lot of the materials are just hard to get a hold of. And so I knew that once I graduated undergrad at UW-Madison, I wanted to find a way to continue the practice I had started of working in neon and glass there. And I also wanted to gain a different perspective to working in the process of neon, as I had gotten a lot of years of experience then. And so one of my proposed activities, or one of the things that I wanted to do, was understand glassmaking through a different cultural perspective, since a lot of the techniques in Europe and Asia are different when it comes to how people make neon signage. And so that was a central part of my work applying and going to Sweden, was to create a body of work that maybe reflected a different glass culture. In that case, I focused a lot on Swedish design and also glassmaking techniques. And I focused then on using a lot of optical perception, which is something you brought up before. I used a lot of optical perception to fuel different neon and glass sculptures I was making, and through working with different glassmakers in Sweden, I was able to sort of capture the techniques that are specific to that place, but also applying some of the ways that I thought about Swedish design principles. Within the glass community, there are a few key institutions that do the work of presenting and highlighting contemporary work that's made in glass right now. And so there's a publication called New Glass Review, which people submit their work to, and only 100 pieces will get accepted into this juried publication every year. And so I've been lucky to have two works included in that in 2 different years. I had a work from this body of work called Uta that I submitted. So I'm very happy to be published in that. I have a sense that glass will be in my life for a long time. I think that it does depend on where you are located. And so right now, I work as a graphic designer and a web manager for the Glass Education Exchange, where I support glass learners and educators around the US. Right now, my work is mostly centered towards supporting other voices in the field of glass. I hope that I'll be able to possibly take some residencies. But as of right now, a lot of my work is exploring other mediums. I like to create things in systems. And so for me, the way that I will typically work is I have a research theme that I'm thinking about. And from there, I'll try to find different angles or perspectives or mediums to address that theme. So I've pretty much done that since I started making artwork, where I was thinking about ways to capture my imagines. Sorry, I was thinking about ways to capture how I perceived a space, and then I started moving more to optical perspective, and now I'm thinking a lot about Miami in terms of the ways that the land itself has been developed. And so I will typically have a research topic that I'm thinking about. And from there, I will use that central theme or core to build out multiple works. I was always pretty creative when I was a kid. I mean, I grew up just in a very stimulating environment in Miami, and I just had so much beauty and culture around me. And moving to Wisconsin, I also felt that as well. I knew I wanted to be creative in some capacity. So when I was a kid, I thought I wanted to be a photographer. And then when I got a little older and I started to become an adult, I wanted to be a graphic designer. And so I fell into becoming an artist through happenstance of what it takes to become a Bachelor of Fine Arts at UW-Madison, where you need to take general art classes in order to get a degree that specializes in graphic design here. And so through that, taking new classes and going through things like painting and color and understanding things more cohesively, I think that was what really influenced me to realize that I could not just do things creatively as a profession, but also do things just for the sake of creative expression. A lot of these questions are going to keep coming back to graphic design because it influences the way that I see making images. A lot of things that we had to start with began with gestalt and psychology of how you perceive images. One thing that we're trained to do as designers is to try to create images using as little mark as possible. You know, when you think about something like making a logo or a set of icons, you have to figure out the smartest way to construct that image. And so when I started to work more creatively in glass, when I was studying graphic design and starting to move into more artistic mediums, I was just very fascinated in how I could continue playing with the eye, moving away from just 2D design. I use photography so extensively as a way to generate images. So a lot of the ways that I work involve some aspect of looking at something and trying to reduce or find the edges of something. So you'll see that a lot in my recent work. You'll see that when I'm trying to build neon, a lot of times I have to take this really complex item and create a single outline out of it. And so for me, photography is a way to practice looking through and trying to capture what I'm seeing. And with that, when I'm taking photographs of things, I want to try to capture the sensation. You know, I'm not always trying to just replicate something, but I'm trying to convey that sense of immersion that I feel when I have presence with my work. And a lot of that includes scale is super important for me. So one thing that you'll know just from seeing images of my work is that I make things that tend to be human scale, so that either kind of it feels really big when we're standing next to it, or you feel like you're starting to be immersed in the piece. And so I knew that for me, documentation was probably going to be the only way I could convince that magic for people who didn't have an opportunity to experience it in person. When I'm actually in the space itself, I make a lot of works about landscapes, so photography is one way for me to document that landscape or at least start thinking about it. And I love the ability to crop certain scenes or start to take things and save them for later. One piece that I made recently was called Ficus Fence, which is a large format photograph that I then started to cut out to create the illusion of there being a fence or a pattern embedded in the image. So going back to your question, yeah, when I'm taking photographs, a lot of the work I do now actually just I use my phone. So I think that people, when they think of photography, they think of having this very fancy setup But for me, it's a very easy and accessible way to capture how I'm looking at a space. And then I go back to my studio and I start to figure out ways to either translate that into a different work or to take that image and try to modify it or adjust it in some way. I love working with paper and I have a great affinity for using it. I mean, I've pretty much used or worked with paper or flat imagery just my entire creative career. So when I was doing graphic design, you have to use paper to create mock-ups or print things out. When I was working in neon, we work with paper patterns. And so eventually I wanted to start just creating paper sculptures because I really like that relationship between making something flat and then making it 3D. And so for me, I love working with, I love creating texture with paper, and I love that that paradox that paper is supposed to be something flat and static and delicate, and taking all those conventions and turning them around to create something that's just very dynamic and has a lot of movement, kind of like the work I was the work that we're talking about right now. When you're looking at foliage, it isn't ever perfectly still. It usually has some undulating or some movement to it, despite it being such a quiet thing. So I would say going to Sweden was surprisingly not that different in a lot of ways to growing up in Wisconsin. Like I lived it or sorry, in Wisconsin, I grew up in a very Scandinavian town. And so I had some familiarity with the culture already. And I am Swedish on my mom's side. And so there are a few things that I knew when I was going into it. For example, the area where I was studying was known as the Kingdom of Glass. It's a very wooded, slightly remote area. And so it was actually not that much different in a lot of ways from living outside of Madison. And I knew that I would need to learn the language somewhat. So I made sure once I knew that I was going that I would study the language, learn how basic vocab works so I can get around and do things by myself. And yeah, I would say being in a remote area made it feel like I was still in Wisconsin in some aspects. But in terms of the culture, there are definitely a lot of cultural differences, just the way people go about work, the way that people prioritize being outside and having different food traditions. I mean, it was all really great to take in, but yeah, I would say I was at that point, I felt like I got adjusted pretty quickly. And one thing I also want to say too is that, I'm used to I'm what many people call a third culture kid. So I grew up living in Miami and I have a Colombian family on my dad's side. And so there are a lot of things that people will find really uncomfortable, like having to navigate being in different households where you're not speaking English all the time. And maybe I don't understand everything that's going on, although I do understand a lot of Spanish. And so there's a lot of cultural navigation that I already was so used to growing up in like a Colombian and American household where I'm used to trying out like different cuisines, or I'm used to not being able to communicate super directly with people, but still trying to get to an endpoint or like a shared goal together. I definitely have a lot of mental challenges that I'm constantly working on. Like one thing that I am coming to terms with now is that I likely have some ADHD, which is, I think, something that a lot of creative people will have just because it's a great way to keep yourself engaged through a lot of different processes and mediums. And so I think for me, my relationship to art has been kind of challenging at times because I have dealt with a lot of perfectionism within my work. I mean, I think being a designer and being a perfectionist sometimes can go hand in hand. So I have a pretty complex relationship with my artwork. I think that a lot of times I have ideas that I really want to explore, but in order to put yourself out there, you need to be vulnerable and make mistakes. And a lot of times, working with materials like glass, there's an element of failure that you have to just grow accustomed to. And so when I work now, I think that I have to practice trying to be present with the work. I think that a lot of times it's easy to get overwhelmed when you are somebody like me who is working in a lot of different materials. I find that a lot of times ideating is one of my more favorite parts of working as a creative because you get to work loosely and quickly, but then execution can be an element that I think, depending on outside life circumstances like work, can make things feel a little bit more stressful. So I think art making is really important. I find it sometimes to be very serious, almost like work for me, just because I work as a creative outside of my work as an artist. And so for me, I find that I need to remind myself to be grounded and to just keep remembering the magic that I felt when I started working in this process. One thing that I want to mention, since we're talking about art and mental health, is just how important it is to be aware of what mental health conditions you might have and how that might impact or influence the work that you're making. I think for me, I thought of the way that I worked as just me exploring new ideas, but as I'm learning a little bit more about ADHD, I've realized that it's probably one way for me to stay engaged in the work that I was making, keeping things exciting and keeping things flexible in terms of how I approach things. So I think that's really important, is to think about how you want to leverage your strengths. A lot of times we think about these things as a thing that affects us negatively in terms of how we're able to focus or make our work, but I think it's really important to see the possible strengths that what you have can bring to how you see and make artwork. I would say I have a pretty non-traditional approach to how I like to make artwork, where I am not necessarily influenced just by the medium, but more so by the research and the topics. And so for me right now, one thing that I am really fascinated with is trying to make works that are smaller, because a lot of the works that I've made historically have been just so big. I like to make things that have an installation feel to them. I like to make things that are delicate. And so I think right now, as I become older as an artist and have more bills to pay, I'm not in that school or sort of younger 20s experience. I am more focused on using smaller work to maybe have a little bit more sustainability for now. I think that it's really important, as we're talking about mental health, to make sure that you don't bite off more than you can chew. And that is something that I have been doing for about 10 years now as an artist. So I would say trying to move forward a little bit more strategically, trying to make works that are smaller and a little bit more feasible, and also trying to make works that I can start and stop a little bit more easily. Whereas when I work with large processes, usually I have to stop everything I'm doing to get this like really big piece or this really big sculpture created. So that's what I see for the future.
Okay. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about this piece.
Yeah, so I this is the Breeze Block book. This is one of the first artist books that I created. Surprisingly, as a graphic designer, I have worked with paper, I have worked with images, but I have not yet created a book. And so one thing that I wanted to do as a designer and also as an artist is to find more ways to look at my environment. These are all photographs that I've taken every time I go to Miami. I like to capture just all these background scenes. And then I also created these breeze block cutouts. So this is a very common architectural aspect of being in South Florida. And so I use this as a way to kind of capture all these landscapes that I think about and remix them by creating this ability to go through this different space and to have a combination of patterns, architecture, landscape, and space. This gives me a sense of peace. It gives me a sense of just the beauty that I constantly see when I go back to my childhood home. And I wanted a way to capture that sensation that I had and add an element of fun. And I love things like pattern. I love I love landscapes that are more tropical. And so I wanted to find a way to capture all those sensations through the power of design.
It also, to me, gives me a little bit of childhood wonder
Mm-hmm.
because what's behind,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah, I wanted to have a book that was interactive just because some of my favorite artists and designers find a way to add a new element that you don't normally see when you're working with any material.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about your glass piece more in detail.
Yes, so this piece is called hander. This is what you call a grawl technique. So this is a piece that I made with a master glass blower in Sweden at a museum and studio called the Glass Factory. And this piece was one that I made while I was thinking about optical perception. This is also inspired by a famous Swedish glass designer called Monica Backstrom. She created an engraved piece that had two hands on it, and I wanted to create my own version in which I use my actual hands to create the mask and then sandblasted the layers of the glass. You can
Is that how you get the 3D look of the fingers and hands?
Yeah, so there's a layer of black that's over clear, and then on the inside there's a white layer here. And so it creates this sort of mask that has a floating effect or illusion. Yes, so I will be at the Bounty, which is a very cool thrift store in Madison. It's on Park Street. I'll be an artist in residence there, and I will be part of a narrative. So when there's an artist in residence at the Bounty, they create an installation or they'll be making artwork while the store is open, and there'll be a collection of items that are adjacent to my installation that kind of reflect some of the ideas that I'm working on. I'll be there throughout the month of August, and I will be there making work during a few of the weekends. I would tell my younger self not to change the way that he worked because I think that I really didn't know the best way to approach a lot of the things that were going on for me in life at that time. And I have a lot of respect now looking back at my younger self just for how dedicated I was to the craft of learning all the different disciplines I did, just being very curious. I think I would want the younger me to maybe be a little bit more patient and be a little bit more flexible in how I made work. But I would say that I'm so grateful for just the ways that I did create my work because I see the ways that I put a lot of hard work in and how I'm able to really enjoy and appreciate that work today. Thank you everybody for watching and listening. You can reach me at benorozco.com or follow me on socials at Bexoro, Bexoro. And that's the best way to keep a hold of me as I am working on different projects and also different events like residencies and exhibitions. My name is Ben Orozco. I am a multimedia artist and designer, and this has been The Layered Onion.